In this video, you're going to learn how to play the King's Indian setup. We'll quickly run through the basics, and then we'll learn how Magnus Carlsen, the best player in the world, likes to play this opening himself. We'll see the specific variation he prefers, and then we'll get to watch a game of his and see how he converts his advantage once he gets out of the opening. Now, if you already know the basics, feel free to skip ahead to the Magnus section of this video, but what you have in front of you here is the rough King's Indian setup. Now, this setup is great because you can see it's relatively passive, and this means that you can get it pretty much every game with the black pieces and the white pieces, so it's great, especially if you're a beginner player, because you get a very familiar position each game. So let's go to an empty board, and I'll show you how to get into this position and the moves to remember. So, works against anything, so don't worry too much about what white plays. First move to play is d6. Basically, the idea of this is to stop e4, e5, because this can be a bit annoying if white can push that pawn really far. The next move is to bring your knight out. Again, they're just playing random moves. And then we begin pushing our g-pawn. So this is called fianchettoing our bishop. And the idea is we're going to get this really strong bishop along this diagonal. So white just continues grabbing the center. We fianchetto our bishop. And then we castle. So this is the rough setup to remember. And now there's a few plans in this position. So the first thing to remember is you're never scared of white pushing his e-pawn to e5. This looks intimidating because it attacks our knight. But this is the reason why we had our pawn on the d6 square. You simply just take this pawn. When they recapture, you trade queens. White has to underdevelop one of his pieces. And then you just move this knight. You can jump it back. You can jump it forward. And black is doing totally fine here. White's even going to get possibly a bit overextended. And this is just nothing to worry about. Jumping back to this position, the next plan to remember is what to do when white castles queenside, which is king is going this way. So let's say they develop their dark squared bishop. We're just going to continue to develop normally. And then they bring their queen up here, as you can see, preparing longside castle. So the first thing to be careful of is this queen and bishop are setting up a battery. And what white can do is he can offer the exchange of bishops. And like I was mentioning, this bishop is really strong in your position on this long diagonal. So the first tip is to avoid this trade. You want to remember to move your rook so that when this bishop does come, you can slide the bishop back and you're doing totally fine. So that's what you to do when you see the battery coming. But either way, in this position, white will often castle. And now this game is going to get very explosive and you have to be very fast. Basically, white's going to push his kingside pawns as quickly as possible. And you want to do the same with your queenside pawns. You want to march your pawns up the board, play very fast, and you're looking for checkmate. It's a really fun way to play and you'll enjoy it as a King's Indian player. The next plan to remember for the King's Indian is you do want to control the center. Now, at the moment, we're not really doing that. You can see white has all the control, 3 pawns in the center, controlling all these central squares. But we do want to contest this center when the time is right for the King's Indian. It starts off very passively, but then a very common plan is in this position to either play e5 or c5. Now, Magnus's preferred move is e5. We're going to take a look at that later when we do watch the Magnus game. But for the moment, I'll show you c5. So again, we're contesting the center. We're starting to put some pressure on this d-pawn. And you can start to make a serious go at winning that pawn. So the bishop is threatening that through our own knight. You can also develop your own knight forward. So this is just a rough plan of how to contest the center and not let white have all the space going into the middle game. So the last and probably most important plan to remember is what to do when white locks down the center, resolving this tension by pushing their d-pawn. Now this is super common, especially at the beginner and intermediate ranks, and this happens in the Magnus game. So we'll take a look at that, we'll run through those e5 principles we saw before, and then you'll learn exactly how to respond to these early d5 pushes. So here we have a game from Magnus Carlsen. He's up against the IM Rudd Makarian, and you can see it's a King's Indian setup. He has his pawn on d6, he has his bishop fianchettoed, and Magnus's favorite move in these positions is to push e5. So it makes a lot of sense. Like we were talking about, it's important to control the center. Not at first with the King's Indian. You generally start off letting white grab this space, but eventually you have to counter-strike. And this is also a great example of the tactics that belong in the King's Indian. Because at a quick glance, this looks like it's just a straight blunder. It looks like white can just take that e-pawn. When we recapture, they trade queens. And it looks like this pawn is just hanging. But if white takes it, the important tactic to remember, and this happens a lot with this knight and bishop, is this discovered attack. We can take this pawn, and although it looks like a knight sacrifice, it's exposing an attack on this knight so that when white recaptures, we restore material equality. So obviously here, it's not the best. We've just basically equalize things. But a lot of the time, you'll see this tactic work. You'll often be able to win the rook in the corner. A lot of players aren't ready for that. or maybe just win a piece. So always remember that kind of discovered attack tactic in the King's Indian. So going back to this position, Magnus is up against an IM, so he knows that's not a free pawn, so he just decides to castle, and then Magnus pushes c6. Now this is just a generally healthy move in King's Indian positions. It also stops the knight from jumping forward, which is nice, and then White decides to push his d4 on here to d5. Now normally this closes down the center. There is some tension here between the d and c pawns, but the dynamics are still generally the same, so you don't have to worry about it too much, and if White ever decides to take here, you just take back and you're doing totally fine as Black. So in this position, Magnus just ignores the tension and starts pushing his a-pawn, just generally a solid move in the King's Indian. White develops normally. And then Magnus plays the interesting knight a6. Now this looks a bit strange because he's developing his knight to the rim of the board, which generally isn't advisable because the knight controls less squares, but it's totally fine in King's Indian setups and happens a lot because it's just a temporary square for the knight. This knight is eventually wanting to either jump forward or maybe reroute itself down here to put more pressure on the center. So never rule out positioning your knight on the rim like we have in this situation. White's next move is to move his knight away from the f3 square. So this opens up the potential for his f-pawn to either push to f3 or sometimes f4. Although as we'll see, Magnus is doing the same because generally with Black, and this is one of the main plans I was talking about earlier, when this center is kind of locked up, when White has overextended themselves, push d5, it is a really common idea to move this knight away to prepare this f-pawn strike and start marching these pawns up the board and create a kingside attack. So Magnus is preparing that. White is pushing some pawns on his queen side, stopping the knight from jumping forward. And now Magnus strikes with his f-pawn, getting that kingside attack ready to go. So the other point of this f-pawn push is you are threatening to take the e-pawn. So that's why you see White defend it with f3. However, this would have allowed Magnus to push his f-pawn further. Now this is normally the best move in these types of situations. So if you're in your own game, definitely consider pushing the f-pawn here. But Magnus first decides to close down the center completely, removing that tension and pushing c5. Now the problem though is that it allows White to take, giving that potential away from us to push f4, and Magnus recaptures with the pawn. Now this looks a little strange because you're recapturing with the pawn that was in front of your king and making it a bit more exposed, but generally in the King's Indian, with this bishop here, it is very safe for your king, so you can kind of afford to make these aggressive pawn pushes. And we're going to be threatening White a lot here. There's going to be a lot of action on the king side, and even though our king is getting a bit weaker, White's king is going to be in a lot of trouble as well. In this position, White decides to improve their light squared bishop, now putting some pressure on this pawn, and Magnus finally reroutes this knight. Like we were saying, it wasn't doing too much on the rim there, especially now that White had pushed a3, stopping our knight from jumping forward. Magnus gets it to a more useful square. Our opponent moves their king out of the way now, just generally an improving move, because now that this g-file is semi-open, there's some serious attacking chances. And now Magnus makes a big mistake here, but it's a bit hard to see why. He develops his knight over to the king side, getting ready to get it into the action to start a kingside attack. So the reason that this is a mistake is because it's not addressing the key weakness in Magnus's position, which is this f-pawn and his h-pawn. So White's best move here, and what the IM finds, is queen c2. So this sets up a battery, one against this f-pawn, but also potentially against the h-pawn, like we were mentioning, and it sets up this g strike. So we thought we were the ones attacking on the king side, but because our king is weak, and because White has moved their king out of the way, it's very double-edged. Again, you have to enjoy these kind of positions if you do want to be a King's Indian player. So Magnus tries to alleviate the situation. He moves his knight away, lending some more support to that pawn now that this bishop is opened up. And it's an interesting move. I would have expected him to move over to the f6 square, but I don't think he wanted to block his connection with the rook. And it also just goes to show that it is important to play on both sides of the board. So generally in King's Indian setups, you are setting up these kingside attacks, but you can't just tunnel vision on this. When I used to play the King's Indian a lot, I would have that problem. I wouldn't think at all about the queen side. And this knight move by Magnus is just exerting some pressure now on this pawn, which could play an effect later. So White has two main moves in this position. The first one is that g-pawn strike we were talking about earlier, making the most of this battery they set up. Or it's to move their rook to the b file, getting ready to prepare this g4 strike and open up the queen side. The problem is that White instead rushes this idea with the immediate g4. I think their plan was, even though this does hang a pawn, that this pawn would be pretty easily won back. But Magnus has a really interesting tactic and counter-strike to make white really get punished for this move. So first Magnus trades the pawns, then decides to trade the rooks, and instead of taking this free pawn straight away, throws in the only move for an advantage is this pawn sacrifice, pushing e4. Now you can pause the video if you want to try and figure out on your own why this pawn sacrifice is so strong. It took me a while to figure out, but the whole idea is that this bishop is getting opened up and it is staring right at that rook in the corner. I told you earlier in the analysis, there is so many tactics involving this bishop, and you can see even an IM at this level is missing them. So white decides to trade. Instead of trading back, Magnus pushes his f-pawn further, another tempo move, making sure that this line of sight is still available. White's bishop is forced back, and now finally, Magnus takes that free b-pawn, but it is so much worse. Like we talked about, the knight is under attack, that rook is getting stared at with the bishop. White's best move here is just to sack the exchange, jump forward with the knight, but instead, they try and keep everything together, trading off their dark squared bishop. When Magnus recaptures, jumping the knight forward with tempo. It looks like it's saving the rook now that there's an extra tempo to get it out of the way. But the problem now is that Magnus infiltrates with his queen, and this queen is so active and going to cause so many problems in white's position. But there's actually a bigger problem in the position, which is a lot more subtle and hard to spot, and white misses it. They move their rook, which makes sense. It was under attack. The bishop was staring right at it. But now, this knight is actually completely trapped. It can't go forward. Our queen controls those squares going backwards. It can't go to the square it was just at, obviously. Pawn controls that. And if it was to jump back here, well, this queen would be overloaded. The bishop could simply take, and then after the recapture, our queen would take their bishop. So white misses this. Magnus develops his bishop, and the knight is just completely trapped. White tries to counterattack the queen, but Magnus has the nice tactic of taking the knight anyway. The idea is if white takes the queen, we take their queen, and after all the trades, white would be down material. So after that move, white simply resigned. Now, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more of Magnus, there should be a video of Magnus taking on the fried liver. There is some great endgame execution from him, so check that one out, and I'll see you in the next video.